Anthony's going to go first. Anthony is a current Lambda School student. He's studying full stack web development, and he's a self-proclaimed RedwoodJS cheerleader, which is what he's going to be telling us about tonight. Anthony just recently moved to the Denver area, so give him a big warm welcome because we love people here in Denver. And he used to be a teacher, so as he's going through his talk, he's used to people raising their hand and asking questions. So feel free to ask those questions in the chat stream at any time. We'll also have a Q&A after the talk, so if you want to hold your questions till then, that's fine too. So, Anthony, go ahead, take it away.
Great, thanks a lot, Thomas. Really happy to be here. I'm really excited to talk to you guys about RedwoodJS. This is my first chance to give a real kind of in-depth talk, whether conference talk, meetup talk, any kind of talk like that. As Thomas said, I have a lot of experience as a teacher. I used to teach music. And I also spent a lot of time running a performing arts summer camp. And so, yeah, now I'm kind of transitioning into web development. And we're going to talk about RedwoodJS. So let me get my slides up for you. So actually, the first thing I wanted to show you was I've written a very in-depth article series that is very influencing of what I'm going to talk about. So if you go to the RedwoodJS community forum, you can find this, a first look at RedwoodJS, which is this very long, monstrous URL. And I'm going to be referencing it a little bit. It goes over kind of the history of Redwood, what different ideas came together, and then it walks you through basically the entire tutorial. And what I'm going to be going over is going to be the first kind of half of this. We'll talk more about that once we get into the slides. So, as he said, I am Anthony Campolo. My general web handle is AJC Web Dev. If you search that on Twitter, GitHub, Dev2, ajcwebdev.netlify.app has my blog. So that's kind of, I've been squatting on that namespace. That is where I am at almost everywhere. Substack, one more. And that's the link at the bottom for this kind of long blog series that I worked on. And this is the kind of breakdown of it. And the parts on the right, each two sections correspond to one of the videos of the tutorial. And the only reason I point this out is because the tutorial is a very crucial part of RedwoodJS. They've actually coined a term called tutorial-driven development, where they created the tutorial front to back the way they wanted it to work, and then they wrote the code to make the tutorial work. And I actually used the same strategy to write an article recently, and it sounds crazy, but it makes a lot of sense actually when you do it. And it thinks of the experience a developer goes through as they're being introduced to your framework. Because there's a paradox here where if you try and break down all the different pieces of Redwood, it's hard to explain any of them in isolation because they all connect to each other. But then if you show someone a full project, then they're like, oh, there's way too much stuff here. Can you like break this down piece by piece? And so these slides are going to throw a ton of code at you that won't necessarily make a ton of sense. I'm going to go through each of the pieces of Redwood so we have some context, but then when we actually build out the project, it'll make a lot more sense. So a program for generating websites is how I describe this to people if they're not necessarily technical. There's a lot of different ways you can talk about what Redwood is, but I think this is the most succinct and simple explanation. So it's very reminiscent of something like a static site generator, but not exactly. If I'm talking to someone who has a lot of web experience, they've kind of been around the block, they've seen a lot of these projects, I say, it's as if Ruby on Rails and Jekyll had a baby, and then that baby and React had a baby, and that baby is RedwoodJS. So this kind of gets at how Redwood is very unique in that it takes elements of a full stack framework like Ruby on Rails. It thinks a lot about your front end and your back end and how they connect. And it also is very reminiscent of a static site generator like Jekyll. Jekyll and Redwood were both created by Tom Preston Werner, which we'll talk about a little bit as we go on. But if you compare it to either of those projects, you're kind of missing half of the picture. And then also it's mixed in with all this modern React component driven development. So the official title for people who only speak in buzzwords is a full stack serverless framework for the Jamstack. So full stack is like the Ruby on Rails influence, and the Jamstack is like the Jekyll influence. And then the serverless part is something I will get into a little bit later. Serverless is in reference to AWS Lambdas and functions as a service, which is the idea of instead of having a server that's constantly running or like a container that's constantly running, you have just your code, which is individual functions that will be invoked based on incoming events. And this is kind of new, kind of not new way of architecting applications that Redwood has kind of gone all in on. And we'll get into that later in further slides. So this is pretty much the core team of people who are really working on this full time. You've got Tom Preston Warner, who is the original CEO of GitHub, the creator of Jekyll, the creator of Semver, semantic versioning, and Toml, a couple other things. What's funny though is Peter on the right. Peter is actually the Rosetta Stone of this whole project. Peter has written more of the code than Tom because he is the kind of resident JavaScript expert. So the framework very much has emerged in conversation between Tom and Peter and their ideas of how to architect a modern application. And Peter's doing a lot of the heavy lifting in terms of the actual code. Tom's kind of like the figurehead who goes out and he does the podcast, and he has like the big long-term vision of the project. Both of them have been working on this for a long time, like over a year, even though it didn't go live until March. And then you've got Rob. Rob and Tom are longtime friends. They've known each other for like 20 years. They originally bonded over knots, which is something I just learned the other day in one of their talks. And Rob did the whole tutorial. So if you watch the tutorial, he's kind of like the teacher that walks you through how Redwood works. And a lot of this talk is based very, very heavily on his tutorial and kind of how he explains the framework. And then David is like the community social media manager guy. He's the one I've talked to the most as I've been working on these different facets of Redwood and getting to know the project. So there's a lot of other people who are kind of contributing as well. And right now it's a bunch of dudes, but we are very welcoming. We are all very conscious of wanting to make a more diverse community and making it welcoming to anybody. So if you come to the forums, you'll be treated with respect, you'll be treated kindly, your questions will be answered. So we are all very big on that. And yeah, this right here is the most beautiful and most incomprehensible architectural diagram you'll ever see. The first time I saw this, I was like, wow, that looks awesome. I have no idea what any of this means. So we're gonna kind of break this down piece by piece. The most important part is what you see on the left, where it says front end and back end. This is how your directory structure is set up. You're gonna have a web directory and an API directory as it shows there. So first we'll talk about the web front end. And this should be fairly familiar if you've worked with React or Create React app. So we have a public folder and we have a source folder. And in our source folder, you have components, layouts, and pages. And then you have your index.js and your index.html, which is like loading in your app, single page application type deal. And then in routes.js is where all your routing goes. Most of the routing is handled for you by the generators. And we'll get into that more when we actually are building a project. So this should be pretty familiar if you've used, I think 11D has layouts, I think Gatsby has layouts. So a lot of other projects do this where you just have one layout, which is like your nav bar, your footer, your basic, what you want surrounding all of your general web pages. And then you have pages that live inside of that layout, and then your components live inside your page. So that's what that diagram on the right is kind of explaining. And on the left, I'm gonna have basically what it is, and then the generator command written right under it. So Redwood uses yarn. So yarn RW is for yarn Redwood, and then the G is for generate. So you're going to see that command a lot. We use the yarn RW generate command for layouts, pages, all the other stuff that we're going to be building. So it spits out your blog layout, which has a children prop, and the children prop is like your page containing your components. Now, same deal here. We have a generate command, which will generate your page. So you generate the page, and then you specify the name of the page and the route. So you see how we just have the slash. That's what is generating our home route. So when we enter that command, it generates this whole thing, all that code, and then at the top right, that's what it renders in your browser when you open it. So you can see that it's automatically importing your link. So if you've used React Router, that should look fairly familiar in terms of having like your link component, which you use to link between pages. All right, so cells are the kind of new idea that Redwood introduces. So this is a new Redwood concept. It's already been picked up by another framework, Bison. So apparently it works. What you look at the top right is your GraphQL query. So if you're used to GraphQL, that should immediately look very familiar. You're like, oh yeah, it's your post and it's bringing in your post ID. If you've never used GraphQL, a lot of Redwood is going to be a little foreign to you, and it would be useful to study a little bit of basic GraphQL, or else you can learn GraphQL as you go. That's pretty much how I did it, but just fair warning that there's a lot of GraphQL baked into what's going on here. So we have the query, which is basically querying our backend. So we're doing a query, which is blog posts query, and it's pulling in all of the posts, and then it's rendering the ID for each of those posts. And then if we look at the bottom, these are the 4 different states that it can be in. So it'll know whether it's loading or whether you've gotten the data from the database. It'll know whether it's empty. It'll know whether there's been some sort of error. So you get all this stuff basically out of the box. And when you have a success, then it feeds in the posts, and you can do whatever you want with that post. You can map over it. You can pull out different parts of the posts, and that's what we'll be doing kind of in the example that we'll be building out. Okay, so back to this. We saw the bottom left part. We saw the web directory so far. Now we're going to look at the top left part, which is the API directory. So we've got 2 big kind of things going on here. We've got the Prisma folder, and then we've got the source folder, which is kind of our whole backend. Now, what's interesting about this is that Prisma is used by default, and if you're just generating projects, it's going to give you Prisma by default. You don't have to actually use Prisma, though. I recently built out a project with FaunaDB, and you basically delete the Prisma folder, and then you add in the Fauna client into the DB folder, and then you can query it directly with GraphQL or with their native FQL language. So Prisma is a big part of what I'm going to be showing today, but it's actually not necessary to use Redwood by itself. It's just a really kind of big part of it. And we should kind of talk about what is Prisma. So Prisma is not an ORM. This is a very important thing that the Prisma team wants us to always say, is that it is a query builder. If you listen to Nick Burke's talk with Michael Chan on the React podcast, that was like a week ago, he says it sits in between a query builder and an ORM, because you have your database layer, then you have your query builder layer, which is like next or connects, and then you have your ORM layer, which is like type ORM or Hibernate if you're in the Java world or something like that. Whereas Prisma sits in between the query builder and the ORM layer. My theory is that ORM has a really bad name because of an article written about it called ORMs are the Vietnam of computer science, basically saying that it sounds like a good idea at the start, but then once you get in, you can't get out, and you just keep throwing more resources at it. Then before you know it, you got like a million hippies yelling about how slow their queries are, and you're just totally, it's not good. So Prisma is slightly lower level than an ORM, but it's what we use to talk to our database. It's mapping objects to relations, but it's not an ORM. So this is the Prisma schema. So there's three kind of parts of this. There's your data source, which, as you can see, we're using SQLite, and this is just for development. If you follow the tutorial all the way to the end, you end up deploying with Heroku Postgres. So you can easily switch out the different databases just from development to production. And then you have the client, which is the Prisma client, that's the part that is essentially translating your JavaScript into your SQL queries. And then the post model. So if you know model view controller, it's a model. So you're saying that you have a post which has an ID, which is an integer, and it's just going to auto increment. So every time you make a new post, it'll be ID1, next post will be ID2, next post will be ID3, so on and so forth. And then the post has a title, which is a type string, and then it has a body, which is type string as well. And then it automatically gives you a created at time using the now command. So this is all basically coming out of just from setting up your model, which you can then use with a generator to generate it, which we'll look at. So going back to how well you know GraphQL, if you know GraphQL very well, you'll look at this and be like, oh yeah, this makes total sense. If you've never seen a GraphQL schema definition language before, then this will take a little while to parse, but it's actually fairly readable. So what we're doing here is we're defining our types. So if you look at our post model, has an ID, title, body, and created at. Our post type has the same thing, ID, title, body, and created at. Then we create our query type. Our query type is when you query posts, is going to give you an array of the posts. So that's what that says there under type query. And then if you want a specific post, you can query that post with the ID of that post. And then on the right side, these are to actually do mutations. So this is for actually creating a post, updating a post, or deleting a post. So this is your CRUD capabilities. Create, read, update, delete. Also sometimes called create, retrieve, update, delete, just how Rob says it. So the services this is not a new Redwood concept, but it's a very crucial part of kind of how Redwood thinks about the world. And this is the part that took me a while to kind of get. So basically this is how your cell talks to your backend. So you see that we're importing our database, and that's our Prisma client. So our DB is Prisma client, and then we're using different Prisma commands to either find all the posts, that's the find many command, find one of the posts, which will pull in the post with the ID, and then create the post, update the post, delete the post. So all this gets wired up with your schema definition language and with your Prisma model to do all this stuff. So when people talk about frameworks having a lot of magic, what I usually think they mean is that it has a lot of code that I don't know what that code does. And to me, this is the most magical part of Redwood. This is a lot of code. I do not know exactly what this code does, but this is where your whole backend is being stitched together and made into a GraphQL handler, which is then used as your Lambda serverless function. So this is where Redwood enters the serverless realm in terms of being something that can be executed just as a function. This is what takes all of your code. It brings in your schema, which was this thing, and then it brings in your services, which is this stuff, and then it brings in your DB, which is this thing, and then it shoves that all together into one big giant function. So there, if you want to learn more about that, you should check out the docs. That's kind of the best high-level example I can give without saying something dumb. All right, sweet, that's all the slides. Okay, let's build a thing. Okay, so what I've done so far, I just generated the project already because it would have taken a while with the streaming. So what I originally put in was yarn create Redwood app and then Redwood Denver. So that is the command that generates this project that you're looking at here. And then to actually start it up, you do yarn redwood dev. And so that's running over here, yarn redwood dev, which then kicks on your development server. And then this is what you see as the general splash page. So that's all we've done so far. I've just generated a project. I've not done anything else with this project. What you'll be seeing is completely from scratch. So the first thing we want to do is we want to create a home page. So this is the commands that we were talking about earlier. We have yarn rwg. You could type redwood generate, but just to kind of save yourself the keystrokes, we have these shortcuts that are nice and easy to use. So we're going to generate a home page, and it's going to go to our home route, which is /. All right, so what we see here is generating page files. It generates a home page, .stories, .test, and .js, which are all our source and our pages and our home page. So it may look like there's a lot of folders, a lot of stuff going on here, but once you understand how it all fits together, it's really, really easy to navigate, and it's super cool. So this is our home page, and this is our home page. So this is what it gives to us out of the box. So we're going to edit this, and we're going to take out the links. We're going to take out that. This is going to say RedwoodJS, Jamstack, Denver. And then this is going to say, this is the home page. So now we save, and our server is going to automatically update anytime we save our files. So this is our home page. Now let's generate another page. Let's generate our about page. So we're doing yarn redwood generate page, just like we did for the last one. This time we're going to do about. Now I'm not going to specify a route this time, because it's going to basically do everything for us. It basically creates the route, puts it where it needs to be, and does all the stuff. So nothing changes here, but if you go to our /about, we now see we have our about page. So the routes are already set up for us. If we go look at our routes folder, we have the route path to / goes to our home page here. And then our route path /about goes to our about page, which is here. So let's edit this now. We're also going to pull the link out. This is going to say about. Oh. All right. So now what we want to do is we want to create our layout. So our layout, as we talked about in the slides, is our big box that'll sit around our pages. So we want to be able to navigate from one page to the other, and we want like a stable nav bar set up. So we're also going to use a generator for this, yarn redwood generate layout, and we're just going to call this a blog layout. So now instead of being in our pages folder, this is going to go to our layouts folder, and it's going to create this blog layout. So this is the part that's going to involve a bit of typing. So we want to bring in our link, and we want to bring in our routes. So if you've used React Router, again, this should be fairly standard stuff. RedwoodJS actually has its own brand new router that they made themselves, which is kind of a crazy thing to do, but it seems to have worked out. It's very well integrated as far as I can tell. So I've not had any issues so far working with it. So we're going to create a header with an H1. So we're going to take our header from before, and then we're going to create nav. Our nav is going to have an unordered list, and this unordered list is going to contain our links to our routes. And then that's going to go to home. And we'll go to about. Okay, and then now we have all that. We need to actually spit out our children. Okay, that should be it. Okay, so right now nothing is going to happen because we've created our blog layout, but now we have to actually bring in our blog layout to our pages. Let's go back to our home page. So what we're going to do here is we're going to import that component. So we're going to import blog layout from src layouts blog layout. Now we don't have to do any of these // to navigate through our directories. We also don't have to put a .js or anything like that. This is because Redwood has a lot of stuff kind of going on underneath that handles all that for you. So it makes it slightly easier developing experience, and that you just have to say the directory of the thing that you're importing. You don't have to think about which directory you're in relative to that directory, which is like a small but really nice thing that once you have it, you always want it. Okay, so now we're going to pull in, we're going to take this out, and we're going to pull in our blog layout. And then we're going to basically wrap our content in the blog layout. So now we have our layout, which is this navigation bar. Now, if we go to our About page, we're not going to see it because we haven't imported the blog layout to our About page yet. So let's take that, do that, and then I'm going to grab this, and we're going to do back. So now we can go in between our home and About page, and it stays there, and we just have our content living on our About page and on our home page. All right, so now we've got our pages set up. What we're going to do now is we're going to actually get our database going. So the first thing we have to do is we have to go to our Prisma folder, and we have to define our posts type, or our posts model, I should say. Let me just take this out so it's a little cleaner. So it gives you just kind of by default this user example. We're going to change this to create our post. So we have ID, which is int ID default auto increment. That's all good. But we want a title. Doesn't necessarily have to be unique. And then a body will also be string. And then this will be created at, which is going to be date time type. And we'll use the now function. Okay. So now we have this. This is our Prisma schema. So now we're going to run a bunch of commands to actually generate the database and get the database up, and then scaffold a whole bunch of stuff. So first thing we're going to do is yarn redwood db save. And this is going to spit out a ton of stuff that I want to actually show. Yeah, and just to point out, because we're streaming, the things will be a little sluggish. The stuff goes much, much faster when you're just developing locally. So this created our database migration. So this is essentially our CLI is reaching into Prisma's CLI is what's happening here. So this is really more of a Prisma thing than a Redwood thing. And if you do something like I did with Fauna, you won't have access to any of this stuff. But what we did here is we basically created our migration. So we now have this migration folder inside Prisma, which has a README, which will kind of explain what the migration did. And it'll show you the SQL tables. Close all these. There we go. So this is the SQL that it's using in SQLite, which will also work with Postgres. SQLite and Postgres speak a fairly similar type of SQL. All SQL databases have slightly different SQL, if you don't know that. So we're creating a table of posts, and then we're creating basically all of the columns that will go along with that post. So we have the ID, which is an integer, title, which is text like a string, body, which is text like a string, created at, which is date time. So even if you don't necessarily know SQL very well, this should map fairly well to what you're looking at in your Prisma schema, which then is also going to map very well to your schema definition language. So we're kind of writing the same thing in all these different languages so that the whole data flow understands the types of the entities that we're working with. All right, so we did db save. Now we're going to do yarn redwood db up. And that's going to take a second. And then after this, we're going to do our scaffold command, which is going to make a whole, it's going to basically create our entire blog admin interface. So this basically now ran those SQL commands. So you see we have the 3 raw SQL commands. We have the 1 create table command. And now this is pretty much good to go. So now what we're going to do, we do yarn redwood generate scaffold post. Okay, so this is going to make a lot of pages. It's also going to make a lot of cells, and it's going to create services. It's going to create a whole bunch of stuff. And in my blog series in part 4, I basically go through all of this code that's generated and kind of explain it like bit by bit and show how the code maps to the components and how they look and all that kind of stuff. So if you're interested in like really going deep into what all this code is actually doing, that's kind of what the series is for. So as you can see, this generated a whole bunch of stuff. So before we even look at any of that, let's see, what does this stuff actually do? So we're going to go to posts route. Now, this is our kind of admin interface. So as you can see, it says we have no posts yet. So when I showed you the cell, which had like the loading state, the empty state, the failure state, or the success state, right now this is in the empty state. So if we hit create one, or if we hit plus new post, it'll do the same thing. It takes us to our new route, and now we can create a thing. So hello Denver. And there you go. That is our post. Now, if we want to edit, or if we want to go to it, we can show it. So now this is our post page. And say maybe we want to edit instead of saw dude. Maybe we want to say dude, saw. And then now we have our edited body. And let's create another one. This will be deleted. Now, if we want to delete it, we can click delete. It's going to say, are you sure this is actually going to delete it? And then you hit OK, and bam, post deleted, post is gone. So this is, we are looking into our database right now is what we're doing. And we're interacting directly with the database. And as you can see, all of the CRUD capabilities are already there. Like all this work that I'm not doing, as DHH would say. So now that we have this, let's just create a couple extra posts. Okay, so now what we want to do, and then this will be the last part, is we want to create a cell that we can put on our home page that's going to basically show all of our posts and let us format our posts however we want. So we're going to go yarn redwood generate cell, and this will be the blog posts cell because it's going to be a cell that's going to fetch all of our blog posts. So now this is in our web front end. So we've looked at layouts, we've looked at pages, but we haven't looked yet in our components folder. So this is all the stuff that was generated when we did the scaffold. And this is the stuff I go into in the articles and don't really have time to talk about. But what we want to look at right now is our blog posts cell. So right now, this is basically our cell as a kind of default. We only have to change a couple things. We want to change this to posts, that to posts, that to posts. This is so everything speaks the right language. Our schema definition language and our services all had this as posts. So we can bring this in now into our project. So if we go to our home page, we're going to import blog posts. So from section components, blog posts. So, okay. And then we're going to put it inside of our layout right under, this is the home page. And this is just going to be a single self-closing tag. Okay, so now if we go back to our home page, okay, so now what's happening is you saw how it briefly showed loading. So it shows the loading state while it's loading the data, and then it's rendering out our data. So right now, it's just rendering out the ID, and it's letting us know what the type is that we're getting. So the type is post. So if we go back to, so if we want to get more than just the ID, we change our query here, because this is our GraphQL query that's pulling out the data. So we want this to say, instead of just ID, we also want title, we want the body, and we want created at. So now you're going to see on the right, we now are actually seeing our posts. We're seeing our title, we're seeing our body, and we're seeing our created at. But we want that to look a little nicer, so we can change our output here at the bottom. So right now it's just using JSON.stringify to just spit out the data. This is actually a really nice default because it kind of guarantees that you'll always see your data regardless of what kind of query you're doing. But we want to actually be able to do something with this. So we're going to map over our posts. So if you're used to React, you've probably done this a ton of times. So we're going to do article key, and this is for the post ID, because React yells at you if you don't do this. And then you do a header, and then we're going to create a header, and this is going to take in our post title. Title. And then underneath our header, we're going to create a div. And this is what's going to show our created at time, so when our post was created. And then we want to actually see the body of the post as well. I think that should do it. Killer. All right, so now we see we have our post title, when the post was created, and our post body, and it's rendering each of our posts. And then if we really want to get fancy, we can use our graphical editor, our IDE type thing. So this is basically lets us query directly. So we want to do posts, we'll put the ID and title. So let's just do the title body. There's our posts. Boom, done. All right, that's yeah, that's the whole presentation. So that is the first half of the tutorial. That's basically part 1 and 2. If you watch those videos, you'll kind of end up right here in the project. And then part 3, you build out a contact form, and part 4, you actually deploy this to Netlify and Heroku, and then you create authentication and use Netlify's built-in login form. So you're halfway to like a fully done app deployed with a database with authentication.
Awesome. Thank you, Anthony, so much. Appreciate it. So I actually have a ton of questions, but I'll start off with just this one. Let's say somebody wanted to dive into Redwood today and ship something to production or whatever. Who's the right person to do that right now? What's the role, or what product are they building? Who's the ideal person to jump into this today?
So like what kind of project is it aimed at specifically?
Yeah, I mean, I assume it's trying to be generic.
Sure.
But like
Sure. Well, I can say that the first production app that was built with it was Predict COVID. So this came out back in March. So it was used to create a real-time, basically data visualization tool to visualize COVID. And this was like middle of March. It basically showed how we were trailing Italy by like 10 days. So it was used to create real-time data visualization. So this is actually, the blog is a very simple, basic way to understand how the different parts of the framework work together. It's not a very good example of what the framework is capable of. This is something that they always say. So for me personally, it was incredibly useful just to learn Redwood, and that's why I think it's a good way to kind of present Redwood. But it can be used for really high level type productions, because the whole idea is that it wants to give you the availability, scalability, and performance and security of a Jamstack site while also letting you hook into a backend. So it's trying to push the Jamstack outside of what it typically is used for into more high-level production applications. And it's about pushing the envelope of what the Jamstack can do. And by using your serverless functions is how we're extending the Jamstack further out into these other parts of the stack.
Yes, so just to clarify on that point, all of that backend stuff you were building with all the GraphQL and the Postgres stuff, that in your tutorial, that all gets deployed to a serverless like Lambda stuff?
So that's a good point. So the way the tutorial is set up now, it eventually gets you deployed to Heroku Postgres. So you have a Postgres server. However, just yesterday, Fauna published a blog article that I did where I showed how you can connect Redwood to FaunaDB. So when you connect to FaunaDB, you have literally a serverless database. That is, as far as I know, the first time anyone's ever put all that tech together. And so it's obviously still, that's kind of very rudimentary, it's like a little hacky, but it is possible. And if someone wanted to kind of follow along with that and then build out a production app from that, you would be scaling completely serverless with your database as you build out your app.
Yeah, I love the potential here. I'm like all in on serverless. All my data's on Dynamo and,
awesome.
and Lambda functions, and this is great. You know, like being able to spin this kind of stuff up. So it's awesome. Are we seeing any questions from the stream right now, Zach?
We're not right now. So,
do you have any questions, Zach?
Yeah, Zach, do you have any questions?
Yeah, I guess more, not so much questions, but maybe just more of some points I've noticed. Like, I've heard about Redwood for a little bit, so it was really cool to see like a deep dive of like how that all kind of works together, and even the point of like a serverless DB. I feel like that's the one piece that's like, how can anyone make that serverless? And it seems like, well, at least Fauna, with like the fact that you can connect into Redwood, can connect into that, you could have a fully serverless application, which is pretty cool. And also your comment on how this could be used for more enterprise apps. I feel like that's kind of the one thing kind of holding back Jamstack, is like everybody's still trying to figure out how can we make this like scale for a large enterprise application. And this, I feel like maybe Redwood fits that mold for what some people are looking for.
Yeah, absolutely. Because if you think about it, Tom, he built out GitHub with a team of people using Ruby on Rails. And obviously you eventually hit scaling issues with that, but it gets you to the point where you even have scaling issues. Mm-hmm. And so it's the idea of like, okay, this is going to get us like 80% of the way for all that stuff. And then you can start architecting it with like the different serverless parts to make it really, really scale. But it gives you a ton of stuff from the beginning and helps you think architecturally long-term about how to actually make it maintainable. Yeah. And this is something that I didn't really have time to get into with the services, is that it's very much about isolating your business logic into the services. So Tom has built out a lot of very large, very high scale applications. So he already has kind of the idea of how some of these projects go off the rails. And he designed the architecture with the serverless is kind of separating out your business logic in a way that makes it easy to scale. And so like you guys have been saying, the database part is really all you have to figure out. And then everything else is already primed to be this massively scalable thing that can just, go to the moon.
Yeah. All right, we did get a question in from Saucehammer, and he asked, does Redwood provide any built-in tooling for authorization/authentication?
Totally, yeah. So as I said, I kind of went through the first half of the tutorial. So if you go and watch the official Redwood tutorial on their YouTube page, actually it's It's on Rob's YouTube page, but if you just search Redwood tutorial on YouTube, you'll find it. The very last part 4, is where you build out authentication. So Redwood has an auth library, it has an auth generator. It is by far the simplest authentication I've ever used. It was actually really incredible. And the only reason I didn't go into that is just it would have taken another like half hour to kind of get us deployed and get all that kind of stuff going. But yeah, it has a fantastic auth story, and there's a video of Tom explaining auth in like 5 minutes on YouTube also.
Nice. All right. I'm not seeing any extra questions right now, so
It looks like we just hit the hour mark, so that's pretty perfect.
Cool. Thank you, Anthony. That was a great kind of dive into Redwood. I never, like Zach, I'd never seen it before, so thank you for going over all that stuff. That was great.
Yeah, no, I hope it all made sense. Like I'm super passionate about this framework. Like I've spent a lot of time kind of learning it and getting into it and working a lot with the community. And it's a great team of people working on it. And it's a really cool project. It's a lot of positive energy around it. So we really want any type of contributor. Like I'm someone who, as you said, I am a bootcamp student. Like I'm not a professional developer at all. Like I'm a professional delivery man. So like I've been able to get spun up with this and start seriously contributing to it in the sense of like writing articles about it, helping out with just kind of like building out proof of concepts like I did with FaunaDB. So it's empowering. It's a really empowering framework.
Nice.
Cool. Yeah. Awesome.